Once Again is funded in part by Union Bank and Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media. Family-owned for 60 years, UBT and its people are invested in the success of families, businesses, and communities. Member FDIC.
A tidal wave of terror engulfs the screen.
Nuclear power has always had an image problem. Scary atomic monsters starred in movies during the 1950s and 60s.
The H-bomb blasted it loose from the depths of the Pacific. But not even the H-bomb can kill it. Fire!
Scary atomic power plants took over for the monsters in films in the 70s.
The China Syndrome. Today, only a handful of people know what it really means, and they're scared.
Everybody keep your station! Everybody keep your station!
Soon, you will know.
Sometimes reality overshadowed the fiction. 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, Chernobyl in Russia.
It's now clear that the Soviet Union has suffered one of the worst disasters in the history of nuclear power.
There was a time when the potential for atomic power seemed limitless. The U.S. government joined with an electric utility in Nebraska to build a nuclear reactor and then fired it up.
In 1963, electricity produced by nuclear power began flowing through the substation. The Hallam Nuclear Power Facility was on the line.
It became one of the first in the United States to provide electricity to homes and businesses. It didn't work out as hoped. In a matter of months, they shut it back down. It may not have lasted long, but Nebraska was one of the first states to explore atomic power. Today, as the world once again considers the benefits of nuclear energy, it's amazing that a little atomic plant in a cornfield near the village of Hallam may be an inspiration for a whole new generation of small nuclear reactors.
I think we need to revisit Hallam, and I think your story is timely.
You know, I agree. It's time to revisit the Hallam Nuclear Power Plant. This is Once Again, a podcast from Nebraska Public Media about the stuff of history that's shaping the news today. I'm Bill Kelly, your host and researcher. I think it's fair to say most people in Lincoln, Nebraska are surprised, even shocked, to find out there is a dead nuclear reactor buried just a 20-minute drive south of the state capitol building. It's near the town of Hallam.
They call it the grassy knoll, I guess. The grave.
Chris Timm works for the Nebraska Public Power District. NPPD shares this radioactive property with the federal government, the U.S. Department of Energy. Chris makes sure that what happens in the grave stays in the grave.
We make sure there's no erosion. We're not exposing any of that concrete that's underneath there.
No radiation has escaped since the tomb was sealed.
And then when we get up on top, there's a plaque on there that you can read.
Chris and I climbed the small slope to the top of the flat-as-a-table grassy knoll, about the size of a high school football field.
Kind of walking around this way.
Yeah, we'll just walk around up on top of it.
It's right next to the coal-fired power plant humming away in the background. There's a big white building on the north side.
This is a vault. It's like a bank vault. This is closed and it's sealed, so this is supposed to be in here forever.
On the side is a large silver metal plaque.
So on the plaque, it says, do not remove this plaque, open the capsule, excavate, or drill in or near this area, or attempt to penetrate.
Encased in the tomb are reams of documents and engineering diagrams. So if all of us go away, there's still kind of an instruction manual behind this thing.
Yes, they would have to open that up.
On the plaque, a diagram outlines the footprint of the building buried under the soil 60 years ago. It shows the precise distance from the vault to the reactor buried below.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
So future explorers can pace it off.
14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So the reactor is probably directly under our feet right now.
Yep, very close. Yep.
You guys just take this for granted that there's a nuclear reactor right under our feet right now.
You know, this has been decommissioned since the mid-60s, so it's, yeah, you kind of take it for granted, you know.
I'll explain later why the Hallam nuclear plant got shut down and buried here. Interesting story. But there's also an interesting story behind how this plant, one of the first nuclear power plants to be put online in America, came to be built in a Nebraska cornfield. It starts with President Dwight Eisenhower.
Members of the General Assembly.
Speaking before the United Nations General Assembly in 1953, Eisenhower let the world know America hoped to lead the world in the productive use of atomic power. He called it Atoms for Peace.
This greatest of destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind.
A lot of the public, anytime you talk about nuclear, their first image in their mind is a mushroom cloud.
That's John McClure, the lead attorney with Nebraska Public Power and the utility's unofficial historian.
Only the military had the authority to even deal with what was then atomic technology.
To figure out, of all these different types of nuclear technology, which ones were going to be the best to commercialize.
That's Tom Kent, CEO at Nebraska Public Power and an electrical engineer by training.
And how do you turn it into a peaceful use that can provide low-cost, affordable energy to the masses? That was the goal, and that remains the goal today.
You've heard of the space race with the Russians in the 50s and 60s. Sputnik, John Glenn, Man on the Moon. We won that race, FYI. But there was also a reactor race underway. And not just with the Russians. A number of countries, allies and enemies, all wanted to be the first nation to get a nuclear reactor online selling electricity to civilians.
And so that was part of the reason to have the, quote, race, right? To make sure that we had a role in the peaceful, safe use of that technology, not just in the U.S., but broader than the U.S., to help grow the U.S. economy.
So how the heck did Nebraska find itself on the starting line of the reactor race? Consumers Public Power, the state's largest district, applied to the federal government to host one of the first reactors in America.
One of the planning people and leaders at NPPD, or Consumers, was quoted as saying, there's less than 20 years of natural gas supply left in this country. So they were looking at what other technologies might be out there, and that's why they started focusing on the potential for an atomic power plant.
And it just so happens the federal government is eager to find these peaceful uses.
I think that's a fair characterization.
Political leaders lined up behind the idea. Governor Victor Anderson called the prospect of an atomic plant one of the greatest developments in the state's 100-year history. The prospect of new jobs and bragging rights as the center for groundbreaking technology.
This is not for the faint of heart
to
take on a
Absolutely
nuclear power
not.
plant.
Absolutely not. And at the root of the decisions that were made then and the decisions that are made today is how does it benefit the consumers, the people, and how do we ensure that we manage that risk appropriately?
One objective of this program is to advance the time when the cost of nuclear power will be reduced to levels competitive with power from conventional fuels.
That's a promotional film produced about the Hallam plant by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. Those federal officials took a lot of interest in how a coal-fired plant could supplement an atomic plant. Consumers Public Power wanted to build its new coal-powered plant on one side of a generating turbine. The federal government would pay for the nuclear plant on the other side.
Consumers, I think, was very prudent in how it approached this. It did not want the nuclear risk because, again, it was a new technology and it didn't want to put that on its ratepayers.
The nuclear plant would be built and run by Atomics International. Its engineers had already built an experimental reactor out in California. The federal government would pay for the $50 million project, and there was no guarantee it would work as hoped.
If the reactor portion, the nuclear side, didn't work, you had the conventional facility there to produce electricity and to serve that growing load. So it was, to me, the best of all worlds that Consumers put together to meet the needs of its customers, but not take on a risk with a new technology.
The Hallam Nuclear Power Facility looms up in startling contrast to the surrounding farmlands.
I love the videos that were produced. Part of it is really an ability to go back in time and see how those reactors were operating.
This is Anna Erickson, a nuclear engineer, researcher, and professor at Georgia Tech. Turns out she's kind of a fangirl of the long-forgotten Hallam reactor.
So as far as the demonstration reactor project go, Hallam reactor is one of the more fascinating ones.
She's here to help explain what makes Hallam fascinating and even historic in the annals of atomic power. I've been told most nuclear plants running today work like glorified teapots. They heat up water, which makes steam, which pushes a spinning turbine in an electrical generator.
We use coal to heat up the water. The water then turns into steam, which we use to turn the turbine and produce electricity.
These days, nuclear reactors use water to create steam and cool down the reactor. Nuclear fission, splitting the atoms, creates heat. The trick is to transfer the heat to the water in a safe way, to keep the radioactivity contained. Most reactors pressurize the water to heat up the steam.
Just like a pressure cooker, right? If anybody ever used pressure cooker, we know that we can achieve higher temperatures inside because of the pressure that we build up. And that actually allows the food to cook much faster.
Operating a plant needing constant pressure has its own set of issues. So at the same time scientists were learning about water-cooled reactors, they also sought out alternatives, like the mineral sodium. It is sodium that made the Hallam reactor a legend in nuclear power and a bit of a freak. We'll talk more about the sodium technology later when we start figuring out what went wrong.
A pneumatic mechanism forces the lead radiation shield down onto the surface of the loading space.
In promotional films produced by the Atomic Energy Commission, the equipment appears both futuristic and antique at the same time.
It looks kind of like a sci-fi movie when you see them working behind very thick protective glass and having the mechanical arms and the gloves.
And those are basically just giant robot arms.
Giant robot arms, yeah.
Which is kind of cool for 1963.
For 1963 and the 1950s.
These low-power tests provided further assurance that the plant was operating satisfactorily.
What they did in 1962 still seems miraculous and a little scary. This group was triggering a controlled nuclear chain reaction on a farm in Nebraska. History came in two stages. The first came January 19, 1962, at 3:22 in the morning. The technicians started the nuclear reactor at the Hallam plant for the first time.
By the time you get here in this commercial environment, they knew they were going to be successful.
Were they still holding their breath a little bit?
I don't think they were holding their breath in 1962.
Tom Allen, reporting for the Omaha World-Herald, standing in the control room, described the scene for readers.
There was tenseness in the faces of the men before the maze of controls and indicator lights and panels of the control room. Then the 31st fuel element was lowered into the heart of the beehive-like core of the reactor, 25 feet below the surface of the ground. There was no sudden blast deep within the reactor core, no clanging of bells or sounding of klaxons. The usually stoic scientists beamed, and a couple jumped for joy when what they called the point of criticality had been reached.
And so that low power testing was just to confirm that the actual plant design as implemented aligned with all the calculations that go into the design we're saying you should get.
Still an exciting day for those guys.
Absolutely, because you're proving that the design is really doing what you expect it to do.
Perhaps the more challenging tests came in the summer of '62, the wet tests. These would see if the liquid sodium system worked as planned.
It was experimental in that you couldn't point to other commercial nuclear power plants and say, this is how we do it.
The Hallam coal-powered plant had been cranking out electricity since the summer of 1961. The turbine, powered by steam from a conventional boiler, fueled with 40 tons of coal a day. On a spring day in 1963, fossil fuel was replaced by atomic power. Once again, Tom Allen reported the story for the World-Herald.
A switch was flipped, and seconds later, electricity produced from the world's first full-scale sodium graphite power reactor surged across conventional lines, bringing the atomic age to the light switches, cook stoves, and machines of Nebraska homes and factories.
Not just a Nebraska thing, but a world thing at the time. So there's a lot of pride, a lot of explaining how it was working, how they were doing things to ensure safety, all those things that you would expect.
In fact, while putting together our research for this episode, I came across a part of this story that almost no one knows about. It was something that the newspapers at the time barely covered, something that might seem even alarming. And it may shed some light into why the Hallam plant had such a short lifespan before being shut down and buried in the grave.
Once Again is funded in part by the John C. and Catherine S. Angle Charitable Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media.
Atomic power is today's answer for tomorrow's problem.
America shilled atomic power relentlessly in the late 50s. The U.S. Information Agency made the pitch in this film.
These resources, combined with the human resources of ingenuity and scientific skill, constitute the components of the new age of power. Power from the nucleus of the atom.
The Atomic Energy Commission expected the Hallam plant to yield valuable data so even more sodium-cooled nuclear plants could be built. John McClure with NPPD.
It was in its infancy at this time, and that was the whole purpose behind Hallam, was to understand the technology.
The public was fascinated by this. Thousands of people lined up to see a model of the miracle atomic plant at a visitor center. Honestly, it became one of the biggest tourist attractions in Nebraska. The visitors' interest in science mingled with morbid curiosity. A visiting newsman discovered the most common sightseer question to the tour guides was, will it blow up?
Some utilities across the nation saying this is where we need to go next and why. And this is why it is safe and different than the popular culture of the Godzilla movies and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? But you have to go through that education process. You have to build that trust. You have to maintain that trust.
That was a tricky balance, especially when things started to go sideways at the Hallam plant. Now, to find out what went wrong, we're going to wade into the science of the Hallam reactor. Bear with me. It won't last long, and it's kind of interesting. The nuclear reactors you're likely familiar with use water to transfer the needed heat to build up a head of steam while keeping the reactor at a safe temperature.
Liquid sodium serves as the coolant and heat transfer medium because of its high boiling point and excellent heat transfer properties.
Well, let's take a look at sodium. Sodium is not water, it's liquid metal.
In her research, Professor Anna Erickson of Georgia Tech has considered how a liquid mineral might be a good alternative to less efficient reactors needing lots and lots of water.
Meaning, you actually need a lot less of it to produce the same type of thermal interaction, removing the heat from the core.
And then out of the vessel at the top at a temperature of approximately 950 degrees Fahrenheit.
So that's great. So you can actually simplify the design of the reactor as well as make it smaller.
But the engineers who worked on the Hallam project still had a lot to learn about the properties of liquid sodium and the types of metals used in the pipes and pumps moving that sodium through the reactor.
And what happened is there were several corrosion risks and compatibility issues with materials that really created maintenance difficulties for sodium coolant.
There was issues with the sodium contaminating the graphite and vice versa, and that's ultimately why they stopped.
It's kind of pedestrian that this got down to a problem with just a bunch of pipes and pumps.
Well, but remember that those pipes and pumps are the ones that protect the public from radiation release and actually keeping the reactor safe. Now, this can lead to significant instabilities in power production and actual compromise the safety of the entire reactor.
It could have gone horribly wrong.
Could have.
Tom Kent is skeptical of any worst-case scenario unfolding back in '63. With what was going wrong in that plant, was there ever a risk of a nuclear incident?
No, I don't believe so. Not the way the reactors are designed.
The company that built Hallam, Atomics International, had a strong interest in maintaining the public's trust. That company had spent millions of dollars of the government's money even before Hallam.
This was not the first reactor created. In fact, before this sodium reactor, there were a couple of others that were successfully operated as experiments and demos.
It was a pioneering plant built by Atomics International in Santa Susana, California, a government laboratory complex in the hills north of Los Angeles. They called it the SRE, Sodium Reactor Experiment.
Liquid sodium coolant flows into the reactor at the bottom of the core tank.
This film from 1957 was produced by the plant's designer, highlighting engineering principles used just a few years later in Hallam.
This important experiment has confirmed the outstanding characteristics of the sodium graphite reactor.
Atomics International gave the public this assurance.
In this low-pressure system, there is no conceivable way in which the release of energy within the reactor could result in the dispersal of radioactivity in any significant quantity.
That was not true. In July 1959, after that film was released, the reactor at Santa Susana had a meltdown. The extent of that failure did not make the local news until KNBC in Los Angeles reported in 1979.
Tonight, for the first time in detail, our Unit 4 can report on a nuclear accident that happened very near Los Angeles 20 years ago exactly. The evidence shows that there was no large-scale exposure to nuclear radiation. However, industry experts tell us that certain risks were taken. There was some potential danger, and the public was not informed about this.
The LA reporters used government documents and interviews to determine what happened at the Santa Susana facility. It was July in '59 when sensors showed temperatures in the reactor reached dangerous levels. Here's KNBC reporter Walter Olney.
The reactor failed to shut itself down, so it was stopped or scrammed by hand. Reports show the operators did not know what was wrong, but that somehow they decided the power excursion had not affected the reactor adversely. So they started it up again.
13 of the reactor's 43 fuel rods partially melted, and radioactive gas was released into the atmosphere. Even with radiation being detected in the building, Atomics International kept the reactor running for 13 days after seeing signs of trouble. The potential consequences of nuclear reactor accidents had already been well established at the time.
That would be unheard of in today's safety atmosphere.
Here's Dale Breidenbaugh, a nuclear consultant interviewed by KNBC in 1979.
Slipshod operation, I guess, is the way I would describe it, and just sort of a damn the torpedoes full speed ahead attitude, which is...
A spokesperson for Atomics International spoke about the accident 20 years after the fact.
And in retrospect, it wasn't a hazard to our employees or public, and we put the plant back on the line.
Conflicting opinions remain to this day about the danger posed for the public, but one review panel concluded a lack of candor made calculating health impacts extremely difficult.
That's post-TMI. That's when the China syndrome became something in our vocabulary, right?
Looking back on it, nuclear engineer Professor Erickson thinks the timing of the LA investigation contributed to the urgent tone. It was 1979, just as the accident at 3 Mile Island unfolded. But weirdly, it wasn't as if this information was buried. The 1959 meltdown became common knowledge among nuclear scientists. Whole studies were published. One I used as a reference for this story had been available to buy in 1961 from the U.S. Department of Commerce for $1.50.
So it was all out there. It was just not necessarily communicated to the public in a way we're used to today.
At the same time, back in Nebraska, people had read about the Santa Susana plant being the experimental parent of the Hallam plant. The meltdown, though, never really got any attention. The only local reference, tucked away on page 9 in the Omaha paper, reported on a congressional hearing. Someone testified about a fuel failure in California. Emerson Jones, the PhD in-house nuclear expert at Consumers Public Power, told a reporter that such an incident was impossible at Hallam. It was not impossible.
Well, this is why it's a bad idea to say that will never happen. In engineering, we design for risks, right? We don't design for it will never happen because it's statistically implausible to design for every possibility. It's not engineering. That would be a voodoo science. So I don't think the answer was necessarily appropriate.
I learned about all this weeks after I had met with Tom Kent, the CEO of Nebraska Public Power. I wanted to find out what he knew about this piece of the power plant's history.
Well, I'll start. I knew absolutely nothing about it until you asked the question a couple weeks ago and you forwarded some information from the NRC's website. That's the first time I had A, heard of it, and B, read anything on the incident.
Seriously?
Seriously.
Now, in some ways, it makes perfect sense. The current CEO of NPPD had never heard of the Santa Susana reactor accident. The incident at the California plant had never previously been part of the Nebraska plant's backstory. In hindsight, Tom Kent views it as one step in a new industry's understanding of an experimental process that has relevance today.
That history is part of the history that the people that are designing today's versions of similar technology using sodium as a coolant, for example, they are benefiting from that experience. They're benefiting from that history. They're benefiting from those learnings.
I felt like I should talk about it here for two reasons. First, how Atomics International and the government responded to the meltdown highlights the shift in attitudes about transparency. Secondly, the California meltdown highlighted a serious problem with liquid sodium technology. If there is good news out of that, the Hallam reactor benefited. The California scientists figured out what went wrong and changed the chemicals used at the Hallam plant. It made the project safer. As Atomics International put it in the final report on that accident, modifications to the system have reduced the probability of a similar major fuel element failure to a negligible value. In other words, a meltdown probably won't happen again. But the California failure also provided a preview of what would kill off the Hallam plant. There are different problems in Nebraska, but overall, liquid sodium was just too difficult to work with at that time. Years of additional research would be needed to figure out how to move it around effectively with the pipes and pumps.
So the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, was actually the body that decided to shut down the reactor, even though the utility itself created a path forward to repair the leaks and improve the safety of the reactor. The AEC decided against doing that and instead shut down the reactor altogether.
They gave up too soon?
They gave up too soon. I would say so.
You might have expected a conservatively managed utility like Consumers Public Power to quietly return to coal and back away from atomic energy after that experiment in the 1960s. Well, you'd be wrong. One day in 1965, they canceled that federal contract. The very next day, the board of directors approved a study for a new light water nuclear reactor to be built along the Missouri River. It's now known today as Cooper Nuclear Station. And as you're about to learn, once again, we're hearing about a new generation of small nuclear reactors. Some could use liquid sodium, technology considered dead and buried in the very same tomb as the pieces underground in Hallam, Nebraska.
Once Again is funded in part by Union Bank and Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media. Family-owned for 60 years, UBT and its people are invested in the success of families, businesses, and communities. Member FDIC.
By 1990, there were a lot of nuclear power plants in the United States, 112, and Nebraska had 2 of them. Both came online in the 1970s, and it was around that time the world began to have some second thoughts about the 60s-era hype over atomic power.
Has been activated. That is correct.
At the time of that 1959 meltdown at the California sodium reactor, the federal government didn't really have any required emergency drills.
I'll be using the nuclear emergency alarm, then I'm making a planned announcement about evacuation to the administration building.
There weren't procedures for letting the public know what was going on.
A site area emergency has been declared at the Fort Calhoun Nuclear Power Plant by officials of Omaha Public Power District.
In 1996, Omaha Public Power staged this pretend radiation accident at the Fort Calhoun plant north of the city.
We are now lowering on RCS pressure.
77 and going down on RCS pressure.
Fort Calhoun came online in 1973, supplying power for the state's largest city. That was just a few years before 3 Mile Island and the China Syndrome. Even while accidents were rare, politicians, environmental activists, and ultimately customers at times felt, we'll call it uneasy. OPPD decided to shut it down in 2016 after Missouri River flooding and damage from a fire made restarting the plant too costly. There's been a steady decline in the amount of electricity generated at nuclear plants since 2012. Over the past decade, 15 nuclear plants closed in the United States. To the south, on the banks of the Missouri River, the Cooper Nuclear Station continues to hum along, run by the Nebraska Public Power District. This time, NPPD went with the reliable water-cooled reactor.
And the first self-sustaining chain reaction in the nuclear reactor was taking place.
NPPD documented the first day in service. The narration for the Cooper film in '74 sounded a lot like the Hallam plant film in '63.
But it's well known that our need for power has multiplied many times. We can no longer solve new problems with old answers.
There are only 21 utilities in the United States that have a license to operate a nuclear power plant to make electricity. We happen to be one of them.
Tom Kent, NPPD's chief executive, told me electric utilities need to generate more electricity without emissions that damage the environment.
Nuclear is an important part of that future.
Important enough that NPPD started looking at deploying a new generation of small nuclear power stations called SMRs, small modular reactors. Small enough to be built in a factory.
So you build it in a manufacturing facility, you've got good quality control, you do it repeatedly over and over again, you get some economies by doing that, and then you take the modules out and put them where you want them.
The reactor box gets set up in a town or next to a business that needs more electricity. NPPD put together a list of 16 places around Nebraska that might benefit from SMR power.
There's benefits to locating smaller generation sources closer to that load where it is, because you don't have the same amount of work to transmit it across long distances.
Here's another factor. Power-hungry new technologies like data centers used for artificial intelligence.
But part of the problem is, where do you get energy for those new data centers?
Anna Erickson, the nuclear science professor at Georgia Tech, went on to answer her own question. Small reactors could provide power in ways that solar and wind may not be able to handle.
What data centers need is very steady state operation, right? So they consume the same amount of power pretty much 24/7. So this is part of the reason why the renewables don't really work well for data centers.
There's a very valid debate over the pros and cons of reinvesting in nuclear power. No opinion on that in this program. We're focusing on history. But here's a surprise.
So while the Hallam project was ultimately deemed a failure and its underlying technology was never fully explored, today there is a resurgence in our need to understand how to operate reactors like this.
Amazingly, the Hallam plant is getting a second look. That little atomic power plant in Nebraska, the one with a liquid sodium system that caused all those problems, may turn out to be a solution.
And part of the reason why we see this resurgence is countries like Russia and China have continued developing sodium-cooled reactors. And they actually did incorporate lessons from early experiments like Hallam.
Is there anything comparable to the Hallam plant in current operation?
And not in the U.S.
Looking at the options available for small reactors, Tom Kent has been talking to people working on SMRs. They've been studying the Hallam plant systems, what worked and what didn't.
I know because of the lessons from the 1960s, we've advanced the technology to answer a lot of those problems that were encountered in the 1960s.
So we've kind of gone full circle with this technology now.
Yep. Certainly some of these new advanced reactor designs are using the same kind of technology that started with the technology that was demonstrated at Hallam and other demonstration facilities.
Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me. I'm glad to see it.
But it's been on the shelf all those years.
Yeah, it has. Times change.
There's another part of the Hallam legacy that's pertinent today. The part of the nuclear plant that still chugs along above ground to this day. The turbine and generator that makes the electric power. Plant manager Chris Cerveny took me up to the generating room to look at the machine that's still spinning away after 60 years.
Obviously built to last, right? Because it's still operating.
There's an inscription painted on the side of the generator.
Yeah, Sheldon Station, not the biggest, just the best. This plant just has a unique history and people are proud of it.
It's powered by the coal-fired plant NPPD built with its own money, separate from the federally funded atomic demonstration plant. They did it just in case things didn't work out on the nuke side. Turned out to be a pretty savvy bet. This may be Hallam's most important innovation, the first ever power plant in the world where fossil fuels and nuclear energy powered the same generator.
The fact that you can place a reactor control room together with the coal plant and actually make them cooperate, that's a great story. That's a great lesson.
If SMRs take off, locating some of them next to existing coal or natural gas plants would cut infrastructure costs between 10 to 30% by some estimates. Will it work?
And I don't think we can debate that because for a year the reactor operated successfully with not a lot of operational issues.
And that brings us back to the reactor buried next to the coal-powered plant.
Most people come in here every day to work, you see all the cars in the parking lot, and they don't think twice about it.
Todd Chin, the environmental officer with Nebraska Public Power, reminds me there was never a recorded radiation accident when operating the plant. There's never been signs of radioactivity seeping out of the grassy knoll. He's the one who checks the monitoring wells.
The water would be your first indication. So if we had something show up in our water, then it's like, okay, we might need to do further investigation.
For decades now, there have been no big radiation problems here. If that keeps up in 50 years or so, the nuclear scientists figure the risk will have gone away.
And they're estimating in 2071, that'll be the last time they'll have to sample. They're hoping everything will be decayed by then.
So if there's a requiem for the Hallam plant buried in the grave, it seems like history will have to answer the tricky question about the legacy of what was both an experiment and a demonstration for the rest of the world. And here's the question, first to Professor Anna Erickson of Georgia Tech.
Was the Hallam plant a noble effort in the name of science, or was this something that just never should have came to pass?
Well, I think this was a great attempt in understanding how we can operate those advanced reactors in a safe and efficient way. Hallam, in my opinion, is really a unique design, and I would actually like to see if we can build upon the knowledge that we gained from Hallam reactor and improve our utilization of nuclear fuels.
And Tom Kent, the CEO at Nebraska Public Power.
I don't think I'd characterize it either way. I think it was a necessary step in the development of civilian nuclear technology. And that's not only the Hallam project, but the other projects that were done at the time that were part of the Atoms for Peace program helped us get on a path to have the nuclear technology that we have today.
To be honest, I think it was probably a bit ahead of its time. I think Hallam could have gone in a very different way. So I would say that don't discard Hallam yet, you might hear about it again.
The energy from the nucleus of the atom is the energy we need for tomorrow's power. In most reactors, the core can't be seen because it's housed in a very complex installation like this. Here, the nuclear reaction is contained, controlled.
You have been listening to Once Again, our exploration of history that's shaping the news today. It's a copyrighted production of Nebraska Public Media. If you like what you heard, leave a review where you found us. Once Again is produced and researched and hosted by Bill Kelly. That's me. Audio production is the work of co-producer Emily Kreutz. Field audio by Jared Stutzman, studio audio by Jeff Smith and David Hughes. Editorial review is handled by news director Jay Omar. Research support from Jordan Howell and Anna Rose Wolm. Alexa Scargill is the Nebraska Public Media Archivist. Special thanks to Anna Erickson for providing technical background, and Grant Otten with the Nebraska Public Power District. And thank you to the voice actor you heard, Harry Stoner. Some sound effects were acquired through the BBC's online archive. On our webpage, we've got links to the archival films we featured in this episode and a list of sources and documents used in our research. That's at nebraskapublicmedia.org/onceagain. While at the website, you can also drop us an email telling us what you thought about this episode or the entire series. Thanks for listening to Once Again.
Once Again is funded in part by the John C. and Catherine S. Angle Charitable Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media.